I will not be alone up here for the entirety. I'll be joined soon. Make sure I can see y'all. All right, everybody. I am grateful, ecstatic, overjoyed, lots of positive adjectives to have with us two very long time climate champions here in the state of Massachusetts. With me today, US Senator Ed Markey for the state of Massachusetts, Mindy Luber, President and CEO of Ceres. And let's get right into it. Let's start where we are. This area, Boston area, has long been a hub of innovation and excellence in this sustainable finance space. What's happening here in the Bay State in 2023 that you'd want to highlight for us in this space? I'll go with Senator first.
Oh, great. Well, last week, Governor Healy announced a new green bank of $50 million, but it's following on an initiative which I was successful last year in putting into the IRA for a $20 billion national green bank financing system across the country. And those rules and regulations are going to be promulgated in the very near future. And all across the country, there will be eligibility for private and public sector projects. McKinsey has determined that $20 billion will unleash approximately $250 billion worth of private sector investment. And in addition to that, there's a community solar bank coming nationally. Again, this is not just for Massachusetts, but all across the country in terms of potential eligibility. And it's going to be explosive what happens. And 40% of the funding, by the way, has to go into communities of color, into disadvantaged communities. So it absolutely meets all of the goals of job creation, reducing greenhouse gases, but also making sure the EJ community gets met. But explosive private sector opportunities will be there. And in Massachusetts, we have something called the Engine, which is over at MIT related new clean tech firms. The same thing is true for the Propeller, which is a new engine for investment that looks at ocean-related new technologies, new projects. And we have Greentown over in Somerville, 200 companies over in Somerville that are green tech oriented. Saudi Arabia has just invested in Greentown in Somerville, Massachusetts. We got to keep an eye on that, by the way. But it's all part of what Massachusetts thinks of itself as the not just the Bay State, but the brain state leading on these issues.
Awesome. And Mindy, what are you seeing in the brain state?
So I'm just going to follow up on something Senator Markey said and put it into context. There's a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of bad news. We've spent a lot of time talking about anti-ESG politics and what's going on. What Massachusetts is showing us, coupled with the IRA, is this is the most transformative moment in time for clean energy, for clean transportation, for developing a new economy that is about jobs, that is about every high-emitting sector and where we go with it. The fact that the Massachusetts Green Bank is $50 million focused on housing and energy efficiency and equity, it is one way to think about how do we finally get to? Massachusetts has a lot of old housing stock. Everybody said never get to it. It's just new buildings that will be green or clean. This allows us to go into every neighborhood and every building and think about how to refinance and re-technology, not a word, but them. And the key point to note is Massachusetts is only able to do this because of the IRA. And I know we've talked about that. But the concept of $369 billion coming into our economy in the United States to create jobs, to change high-emitting sectors, the $2+ trillion, that's trillion with a T, not billion, in infrastructure money, allows us to think differently for the first time in 40 years. Think about it. If every new road that's built, and bridge and hospital and school, is built with different cement and different concrete and different steel, we start building out a future for our kids that actually is viable. And if we don't do it and everything is, let's same old, we are not building out our future. So for all of us, every one of us, figuring out how to make sure the IRA is successful, making sure projects like the Green Bank, although many businesses are taking advantage of it, it's up to us to make sure, working with government, that we take advantage of the most transformative moment in our lifetime. $369 billion, largely carrots, not sticks, so helping renewable energy, helping infrastructure for transportation. Nearly $3 trillion in infrastructure dollars. We actually now can do it. It is up to us. We need to do it smart, or shame on all of us.
And if I may, just following up on Mindy, $369 billion just 10 months ago was signed by President Biden. And that's what the Congressional Budget Office thought that bill actually contained in terms of tax breaks, and, as Mindy said, mostly carrots for industries to move rapidly. My Climate Bank and Solar Bank were in that bill as well, and that's up to $27 billion, working, with Chris Van Hollen, senator from Maryland. But then Credit Suisse looked at the $369 billion, and they sent out 50 analysts to look at all the sectors of the American economy. And when they came back in November of last year, they said, no, it's not going to be $369 billion. It's going to be $800 billion worth of tax breaks, because all the tax breaks are uncapped. And so the appetite is massive. And now Goldman has gone out a couple of months ago and done their analysis of it with their 50 analysts going out into all the various markets in America. And it's up to $1.2 trillion, which they now believe is going to be the tax expenditure which is going to take place. So in other words, there's been a vast underestimation of the appetite out there, that the kids were always right, that the problem wasn't technological, the problem was political, and just not having a level playing field, ensuring that those incentives were going to be there. And now we're seeing all of the activity which had always been out there, but now essentially having activating fluid put on it. And I'll give you just one example, which is Form Energy, which is a technology actually funded by the Engine in Cambridge and by Greentown. Well, West Virginia just announced that they're going to have Form Energy go down into West Virginia and have 800 jobs producing batteries in West Virginia, which is the perfect partnership. The inventors and investors up here in Cambridge and now down in West Virginia, there'll be manufacturing workers who will be producing these new devices. But that's going to be just one small example of a massive revolution which is now going to be unleashed by the IRA last year, and then all of the other activities at statewide levels all across the country that will be affected by it.
So just one point on that. Think about it, West Virginia. The senator didn't say California, he didn't say Massachusetts. We need to make sure these opportunities are in red states and blue states, purple states, any other color you want to choose. This cannot be a partisan debate anymore. We've got to use these opportunities to show this is about jobs in red states. This is about the way to deal with the fact that the coal industry doesn't have a future, but the clean energy industry has an extraordinary future. If there were ever an opportunity to take advantage of, this is it. West Virginia, a perfect example.
Yeah. And by the way, we built in an extra tax break if you were in an energy transition state, answering the question of, well, what are we going to do for the workers in those states? Well, we built in a tax break so that there would be an incentive for the new manufacturing to move into those states. So it was thought through in a way in which that transition would be equitable for the economies of those states as well. And there are many, 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 many more companies all thinking about, again, just going back to West Virginia, about that one state and moving in there. So there's going to be a transformation which occurs in the economy of the mountaineer state.
Yeah. Well, I can confirm this audience is much hungrier for carrots than they are alphabet soup. Let's move to a different piece of legislation, actually, the Fossil Free Finance Act. Can you give us a bit of background on the intention, how it's been received, and what you hope to see from this audience?
Well, the goal is just to say, reflecting upon what Mindy and I were just talking about, that this whole idea that, well, you know, wind and solar, all electric vehicles, et cetera, battery technologies, they're nice, but we've got to really just be, you know, realistic here. And we're going to need oil and gas and coal in perpetuity. And we just have to understand that. Well, wind and solar are now cheaper than coal and natural gas. Cheaper. So what do you say now? You know, well, if you're a financial institution, the inexorable pressure of investment already made in existing technologies oftentimes drives their decision making, and they get locked into the past. And so what the legislation is that I've introduced seeks to accomplish is just changing the way in which people view these issues. What we're being told by the International Energy Agency is that we're pretty much up to exhausting our global carbon budget. So we just have to get even more aggressive. But again, the IRA is already showing what the appetite is, and Europe is following, largely because of what's happening in Ukraine. But they're really moving as well now, and our other partners are moving as well across the globe. So what the Fossil Free Finance Act would do is just to pretty much say to financial institutions through the Fed, it's that looking at coal, looking at gas going forward in the future, there's going to be a high bar that has to be passed if it's going to be financed. And it's not just because of our climate goals, it's also because of the financial implications. Yeah. I mean, these are going to be stranded assets, not just here in the United States, but around the globe as our entire economy moves and the global economy moves to fossil-free sources of energy. Yeah.
Mindy, over in your world, convening investors and companies and policymakers, that key intersection to make this whole net zero transition thing actually happen. Sheldon Whitehouse was just here giving us his big little talk about focusing on the political footprint. Carbon footprint is essential, but more focused on the political footprint. How does that land with you and your intersection of those three communities?
Yep. The bottom line is we're making great progress. And let me just talk a little bit about that and answer your question directly. Yep. I mean, what the senator just said is coal, oil and gas, we've got to look at the climate debate within the financial risk. And there is no good risk. The greater the risk, the more companies want to be out of it and the more financial institutions want to be out of it. But we're not there yet. We're a long way from it. We have got to look at climate as a financial material risk, not unlike inflation risk, currency risk, and others. There's a reason that we talked about on this stage just about an hour ago, new standards across the globe on how to look at climate as a financial risk, that there are mandatory rules now in Europe and elsewhere that you've got to disclose and act on the financial risks of climate. The SEC right now is considering mandatory climate risk disclosure. We're not sure what's going to happen. There was a draft rule that came out 6 months ago, very strong, including scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Since then, there have been 16,411 comments, many of them saying, go slow, be careful. We've got a little bit of concern, but we're convinced the SEC will act, making it clear that climate risk is a material financial risk that needs to be disclosed and acted on. And most of the capital markets see that, but there are glitches, and I'm going to talk about the lobbying question. I mean, what we're seeing in the corporate world of publicly traded companies, I spent all day yesterday at the New York Stock Exchange on this, companies realize They need to act on climate. They need to act because the risk is getting greater. It's costing them money. They need to act because their employees want to work for values-driven companies. They need to act because their investors are telling them to act, and they need to act because their consumers care. And we're seeing thousands of companies set audacious goals. We're now working with them to put in place climate transition plans. Goals are great, but they're words. Unless you have exact plans for what you're going to do tomorrow, next year, 5 years, it really is just words. But on top of that, no company should think they could do all that they can within their plant, with their supply chain, but still be out there endorsing what the Chamber of Commerce, Business Roundtable, in trying to kill the kind of bills that help this. And that's crucial. Best practice and leadership will now be viewed not only on setting goals, but how you're going to meet those goals and are you consistent on your lobbying. And in the financial sector, we're seeing 3 years ago, we didn't have one asset manager committed to setting net zero goals. Now we have 340. 3 years ago, we didn't have investors focused on the largest emitting companies. We have 700 global investors, $55 trillion in assets under management saying we are going to act on climate. We're going to make sure every company in our portfolio does. And the investors as well need to be part of the policy debate. That is the policy of moving forward and not stopping anything that's clean or green and about the future.
Yeah, and by the way, Mindy is our national leader on all these issues, so you're in the presence of like the
I know him for a long time.
The national, the national guardian of all of this need to have full disclosure, transparency. Just let people see what's going on inside of your company. You can't preach temperance from a bar stool. You can't tell the rest of the world to do something if you're not doing it yourself. You can't tell people. You can't tell a kid not to smoke a cigarette with a cigar in your mouth, right? So you've got to be the leader yourself. And that's essentially what a lot of these transparency issues are all about. Just so that the advertising of the one or two good things that a corporation might be doing, in many instances is meant to mask the other more nefarious, dangerous activities that same corporation is financing or engaging in. So much of what the Securities Exchange Commission climate disclosure rule debate is about is just how much disclosure should a corporation make, including, in scope 3, throughout its entire supply chain, just so that the world can see it, investors can see it, and perhaps even their own employees can see it. So that they can be lobbying internally in order to make a difference. So we've come a long way in a relatively brief period of time. Much of it is driven by young people. When I introduced with Henry Waxman the Waxman-Markey bill in 2009 and got it passed on the House floor, it died in the Senate. We did not have a movement at that time, which is why I then went to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and I said to her in late 2018, we should introduce a Green New Deal so that we create a movement that creates the momentum. So we would have a moment then when we finally passed the legislation, which is what happened last August with the $369 billion turning into $800 billion, turning into $1.2 trillion, which is going out into the marketplace. And to the extent to which we need the same thing in transparency, that will help these young people, these young voters, to police corporate America to make sure that they're actually putting their money where their mouth says that they're putting it.
So just to add to that, whether you're a company or working with lots of companies, right now, in Europe, they're saying mandatory climate risk disclosure. In the UK, climate risk disclosure. Yesterday, the international standards that were talked about on a panel a half hour ago, the International Sustainability Standards Board, international standards on risk disclosure related to climate and sustainability issues. Even if the United States, during this hopefully very short time of craziness, where maybe climate's not a problem according to some, of course science would implore us to believe otherwise, the world is moving. And that's very promising and exciting for the basic multinational companies that we work with. They don't want a set of rules they've got to comply with in the UK and different in Australia, different in the US. They want to see consistency. So the time is now for simple things, and I would argue they are simple. Implementing and enacting climate risk disclosure rules. All that says is climate risk, when it's material, meaning a big deal, has to be disclosed just like any other risk that companies and investors need to consider. It's moving forward around the world, so you can't get away from it if you're a multinational company, if you're a portfolio manager. Now is the time, just let's move that one quickly, because we've got so much else to do, and the time has come, and we've got to keep up with the rest of the world.
I have a question for you more as two humans, less about your titles and your influence. As you mentioned, you've known each other 40 years. You've been fighting this fight long before there was an industry built around the problem, which 30 of your colleagues in the Senate still acknowledge they don't believe exists. How do you stay energized to keep fighting this fight after doing it so long? It's a tough one, as we all know in this room. It can be pretty demoralizing. So what fuels you?
So I often put it in the terms of Abe and Jesse. Those are my kids. When I was the regional administrator at the EPA, I used to drag them around. They came to speeches. They're now 33 and 28. So they're not, but whether they're 3 or 28 and 33, my kids represent all of our kids, the future. Your kids, nieces and nephews. We are truly in a moment where we have one opportunity to build a world for them that's a viable world and not more complicated and hotter and more catastrophic things going on in their lives. What compels me to do this is if there were a bus coming at my kids and every one of you would say the same thing, we would jump in front of that bus. The bus is coming at our kids. This is moving quickly. We used to talk about 10 years to get to 1.5. I'd say now we're about 7 years. We've got to act at a speed we've never acted before, and what compels me to do that are not only my kids, Abe and Jesse, who, yes, are now grown-ups, still love them the same amount, but for every one of our kids, shame on us if we are not part of building a future for them that is safe, that is prosperous, and this issue can define it one way or another.
Beautiful. Well, beautiful. The planet is running a fever, and there are no emergency rooms for planets. We have to engage in preventative care. And the United States has been the principal historic emitter of greenhouse gases. Still, 20 to 25% of the historic emissions that are up there are red, white, and blue. So we have to be the leader. And we are also, at the same time, the technological giant of the planet. We have an ability to solve this problem. Young people are understandably angry at preceding generations for leaving this problem on their doorstep. When I introduced the Green New Deal with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to create the movement, when we passed the IRA on the floor of the House and Senate last year, that was just the beginning of the acknowledgement of our responsibility as Americans to say to all of the countries of the world, but especially those that are going to feel the worst, most catastrophic effects of it, and they're largely the countries that have not industrialized yet. They're just economic sacrifice zones for the United States and Europe after our historic emissions. We have a moral responsibility to do something about it. And when we introduced the Green New Deal, when that bill passed last year, if you look at Fox News, they said, look at that socialism. Look at what those Democrats are doing to provide socialistic help to those industries. Well, what do you call 100 years of tax breaks for the oil, gas, and coal industry? What do you call regulatory protection for the oil and gas and coal industry for 100 years? And what young people are saying is, give us some of that socialism for one generation, and we'll transform our energy system in our country, and we'll provide the leadership for our world so that we can pass it on to future generations. That's what this conference should be all about. You should feel very emboldened that this sustainable future is now irreversible, not just because of the financial gain, but because of the moral necessity to do so.
I think I can say confidently we feel emboldened, and we very much appreciate you coming, share some time with us. We are unfortunately out of time, but thank you so much, Senator Markey. Thank you, Mindy, for coming.
Thank you all.
Seriously appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And I want to give another emphatic thank you.